Look at this. Let me just start with a picture of from this last couple of weeks. It was a big couple of weeks for the climate movement. There was a global climate strike with over 4 million people around the world involved in some kind of action, one of the largest movements of grassroots-based action in history. Just as for a moment, show of hands, who in the room was involved in some way or other with the global climate strike? Yeah, well, thank you so much for what you did. Good on you. And I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room knows, basically the fundamentals that we need to know about the climate catastrophe we're looking at. Like, we're just moving in the wrong direction. We all know this kind of graph, right? The CO2, the greenhouse gases are going one direction. The pledges, like where we need to go, is way down there. And if we just keep going business as usual, we're going way to that high blue bar. And even the pledges that governments have made that they're not even sticking to would be way, way out of the realm of what's needed. This massive gap between where we need to be going and where we're actually heading. And again, I'm sure that it's not a surprise to pretty much anyone in this room to recognize that at this direction, we are not just looking at some problems. We're looking at the real serious risk of civilizational collapse this century. This is just a chart that just kind of shows how a rough sense of, like, when we hit those 2 degrees, coral reefs disappear. Like, once we're hitting 3 degrees, Greenland ice sheet starts collapsing. And then we get these feedbacks pushing us way out of the realm so that we really look at this risk of a civilizational collapse. But it's so much more than just about climate. Even if we could somehow change those directions of those graphs and make those lines come back into some sort of manageable shape, we've got to look at the bigger picture. Climate really is just one symptom of a world that is completely out of balance. So, if we just take a moment and look at our home, the one place we know of right now in the universe that has life on it, and in this place where humans in the last couple of 100,000 years have had this massive outsized impact on this earth. And just look at the fact that we have been making a horrendous job of mismanaging that impact. And just some of the things that have been going on in the last few decades, just around our whole ecology. We're looking at the fact that half of all marine life has been lost in the last 40 years. The rainforests are disappearing, and that's even before this catastrophe that we've all been traumatized to live through in just the last few weeks with the Amazon burning, and now in Southeast Asia, similar out of control fires happening. Since 1970, in the lifetimes of many of you here in this room, 60% decline in animal populations worldwide. It's like, imagine if human population lost like 4+ billion people. And that's what's been going on, this catastrophe for animal populations, just every part of the world. And even beyond that, there's an insect collapse that we're only just beginning to become aware of. All over the world, insect populations going. And it just goes on and on and on, the vast ecological destruction across the board. We're looking at the fact that by mid-century, 5 billion people will be facing water shortages. The 6th great extinction of species since life began on this earth, except this one is, of course, human-caused. We're looking at the annihilation of coral reefs worldwide, and the forecast that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by 2050 because of the irresponsible way in which most of the world is producing their monocropped agriculture. But to me, maybe the statistic that I find hardest to get my head around, that just really blows me away, is by 2050, there is projected at this rate to be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. So all this is happening. We're looking at this destruction right now, at a global production, this whole global economy of about $92 trillion of GDP. And what is kind of mind-boggling is that based on the most normal mainstream projections for the next few decades, that global production is projected to triple by 2060. Triple the amount of cement, triple the amounts of cars, triple everything. So it's no wonder that many of us wonder if sometime between this place and that place, maybe we'll be looking at some kind of time cover like this as things start to unravel. So this is the dire situation we're all looking at. And I'm not wanting to spend the whole time this evening just looking at these dire facts, but that's the foundation for how we need to look at where we're going from here. And one thing we can be sure about, maybe we're not going to find ourselves facing the end of civilization this century, but one thing we can know for sure is that we are undergoing, as humans on this earth, one of the greatest transformations of the human experience and the relationship of humans with the earth that's ever happened in human history. Now, and as Brian said, I wrote a book, The Patterning Instinct, looking at some of these great transitions and how, above all, how the different ways in which humans, civilizations, and cultures have taken meaning from their reality has actually affected history. And if you look at historically, the transition we're going to be looking at in this next few decades is probably at the same level, at least, as some of these very few really big transitions that happened in all of human history. And in each of these transitions, there's been a fundamental shift in the underlying story that led people to act in different ways. So before we start looking at what's possible into the future, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. And we're going to look at some of these past stories to try to get some context of what kind of transformational shifts we need, and also where our current story actually came from. So let's begin with hunter-gatherer story, and before that move to agriculture. And as you probably all know, as humans, we spent 95+% of our history as nomadic hunter-gatherers. And in that way of being, hunter-gatherers, when they were moving around the earth, had no sense of boundaries. They kind of trusted nature because they had so many different ways in which they could get food from where they lived in their territory. And if something went wrong in one place, they generally moved to another place. And they felt this sense of continual transformation. And their underlying story, the way in which they understood the world, was that nature was a giving parent. Because that's what nature did. It gave to them. And that story led to some entailments, some logical branches that make sense if you think of nature as a giving parent. Well, clearly to them, all living beings then are family. And as such, they had a sense that we all have an intimate relationship with spirits. And they felt that we can trust nature to meet our needs. And that everything, all the things around them, living beings, were connected. And all of these things gave them the sense that the natural world just had intrinsic value. They didn't have to ask themselves about that. Now, all that changed with the rise of agriculture that began about 12,000 or so years ago. And it's with agriculture that we start to discover some of these big separations between humans and nature, which is why I kind of like to, I think of the fence as being this kind of iconic symbol of what agriculture actually means, because it's a separation not just of humans now being separate from nature. We cultivate the fields and keep wild nature out there, but humans separate from each other. Because as we started to cultivate fields, well, what happened was some people got lucky, worked a little harder, began to make some surplus, could keep the surplus, invested it in equipment, and then didn't want other people to kind of take advantage of what they had. So those fences came up, and hierarchies began to develop, inequalities, specializations began to develop. And with those hierarchies came like a new root story in the human experience. It was a sense of like the hierarchy of the gods. And that story brought different entailments with it, a sense of the intrinsic value of wealth, possessions, and power. It's a sense that you can't trust the gods. Like you could have floods or famines or droughts, and the hunter-gatherers could just walk somewhere else, but agriculturists were stuck there. So there was a sense of the need for, you have to worship the gods, you had to sacrifice, you had to have a priesthood to mediate your relationship with the gods. And above all, you had to respect the hierarchy and the patriarchy. And this is, in fact, where the patriarchy first began. And now, for the first time in the human experience, women became the property of the male, objectified sexually, excluded from power, silenced in the public sphere. There's this great story that author Mary Beard tells, how in the Odyssey, the wife of Odysseus, Penelope, is there with Telemachus, her son, her teenage son, and all these men are talking, and she wants to have a voice, and he actually says to her, "Mother, go back to your quarters. Speech will be the business of men." And as she puts it, this is the first time in recorded history that a woman was told to shut up. And it's been like that ever since, maybe changing a little now. And it was like those were with all the different ways in which cultures were, all the different ways in which civilizations express themselves for a couple of thousand years, those were the fundamental stories that each of those civilizations shared across the world. And then that all changed again very powerfully just a few hundred years ago with the scientific revolution. And they came up with a new story. Their story is that nature is a machine. And this was an exciting story for the young new generations starting up, looking at how they could do things in a different way than had been done for so long before. And people like Francis Bacon came out at the prophet of the scientific age. And he stirred people's hearts, talking about how we can establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe, and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. It was a powerful new vision. And along with that sense of conquering nature, as the Europeans began to feel into, flex their power, they took that idea and they saw that not just about conquering nature, but conquering other continents too, leading to this massive global disruption of colonialism and imperialism. And we see there the beginning of the white racist ideology that then became so dominant in these last few hundred years, leading to the genocide of not all, but close to all of the indigenous populations of North and South America. In one silver mine alone in Potosi, over 6 million deaths were estimated to have happened through enslaving people down there, and led to the horror of 12 million Africans enslaved, transported to the Americas, and led to the institutionalization of racism in this country over the generations. So that story then led to what we've inherited today in the modern world. And just to get a sense of the kind of modern cultural patterns we have in this modern story, the modern story is one of separation. In summary, the story says something like this: nature is a machine, coming from that scientific revolution. Humans are separate from nature. Humans are separate from each other. Human progress arises from the conquest of nature. And of course, the earth is a resource to be used for human benefit. And with all of that, ultimately the purpose of life, if it's not explicit, implicit in all the messaging, is to get wealthy and powerful. So this story has led to a life that's really caused separation. So people just in a normal, if the fence was iconic of agriculture, this is the kind of picture that's iconic of our modern civilization. People connected with their technology, separate from each other, separate from the food they're eating. They don't even think about the Chick-fil-A they're about to get served on the counter actually came from an actual animal that was, of course, factory farmed. And that story is put through to us implicitly every time we relate to the mass media that's out there. So, we're all familiar with just looking at the news. We just turn on the news, what's happening that day. And what she might be talking about, whatever, measuring the economic recovery, whatever it is. But what she's really saying when she's talking is some of these underlying implicit stories. She's really saying we're all separate from each other, that we're all selfish, and that that's actually really good, because the way capitalism works is by each of us selfishly pursuing our own ends, it creates the most efficient society and economy for all of us. She's saying that nature is a machine, and that's actually really good, because whatever problems we have, there's a technology solution for those problems. And underneath all of that, the message that she's really giving us implicitly is, well, everything's meaningless, really, so just fill it with consumerism. So that's the story that we get bombarded with all the time. And that story works very well for certain things. It works superbly well as a system designed to mint billionaires. It works superbly well to empower the large transnational corporations, to the point that at this point, amazingly, 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are transnational corporations. And those transnational corporations have just the ultimate reason for their being is simply to grow value for their shareholders, which means consuming the earth at an ever faster pace and basically turning human beings into zombie consumers. And these corporations have their stranglehold not just over business, but over politics, over media, over culture, over every aspect of the human experience today. So this story, of course, as we all know so well, has led to what's now the greatest inequality in history, where the most recent statistics are that now the wealthiest 26 billionaires own as much wealth as the entire half of the world's entire population, nearly 4 billion people. And it's through that story that we keep ransacking the earth for the last of the resources that we can get to keep that growth going for the corporations. And this led to this existential crisis of climate breakdown. So can we shift that story? And I'm going to now give you a sense of what is a possibility for a different kind of story. The story that could actually transform all of those things we were just looking at into a totally different direction. And that's what I've been calling. And this is not just me. There's a number of people out there who have been developing this idea, and I'm just excited to see what they're doing and really be part of what they're trying to express. It's this notion of an ecological civilization. So what is an ecological civilization? It's basically what would we get if we could transform the basis of our global civilization from one that is wealth-based to one that is life-based. And that civilization would be basically put forward a global cultural and economic system that would promote sustainable flourishing for humans and Earth. And the idea behind an ecological civilization ultimately is this notion of ecology. Now, as you know, we're all familiar with, ecology is really like the study of how living systems self-organize. Living systems that have been on this earth for billions of years and evolved ways to flourish on this earth sustainably. And that's the thing about ecologies. When undisturbed by human beings, ecologies can remain resilient for literally millions of years with all the different fluctuations that happen with weather, with shifts in geological shifts, etc. Those ecologies can remain resilient. And so the idea is to actually build a civilization on some of these principles. And an ecological civilization has its own story. It's a powerful story. It goes something like this, that we are all interconnected in the web of life. And that story, just like we looked at some of these other ones that had these various entailments, that story itself leads into certain principles. These are principles of ecology. I'm going to take you through some of those principles, and we'll see how those begin to play out and if we think about what that means for human civilization. So one principle, like, is the concept of diversity. Every ecosystem that's healthy is incredibly diverse, and where all the different parts of the ecosystem have their own part to play and can flourish in that. So this notion of diversity is to respect the dignity of all peoples and groups. And how that would play out in human society is to respect the inherent right of every person to participate in political and economic power. Another powerful part of ecology is symbiosis, living for the common good. And yeah, this is a picture I love. Here's these two completely different creatures, but that crocodile is happy to have that bird pick the little bugs from between its teeth. And each different part of that ecology works together for the common good. And so we can see how that can play out in our society, where each party contributes and receives reciprocally, offering different things and receiving different things from different parts of the society. Another key element of an ecology is what's known as a holarchy. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this notion of fractals, where different parts of a living system self-organize to create a whole, and then they get replicated in a larger scale at bigger and bigger scales throughout all of life, basically, all the way to Gaia. So the holarchy is the sense of how an ecology incorporates a lot of different self-sustaining, self-organized holons or autopoietic pieces within them. And each part is part of that greater whole. And what's key to that is the health of the whole requires the flourishing of each part. So for each part to flourish, that's what's necessary for everything to remain healthy. Now, another key element about ecology, of course, is that it's place-based. An ecology exists within a territory. And similarly, moving from the kind of globalized way of looking at commerce that we have right now, an ecological civilization would have this principle of locality, where society is organized based on its bioregions. And here's a map of California, which looks different than the kind of maps we're used to seeing. It's a map of California based on its bioregions, with the notion that each region has different needs and affinities based on its ecological context. And so in that ecological civilization, communities connect with the land rather than with global flows, primarily as a source of their sustenance and meaning. Another key principle of ecology is human embeddedness within that system, recognizing that humans are not separate from nature, but we're part of the natural world. This is a slogan that I loved when I was in Paris during the COP21 proceedings, which really stuck with me. We are not fighting for nature. We are nature, defending itself. Yeah. Then another key concept is this notion of sustainable flourishing, which right now, because of the way we've destroyed so much of the Earth's flourishing, means regeneration. So it's not just a matter of sustaining what's there now, but we've got to regenerate and start to make decisions and live our lives so that we flourish into the long-term future. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this wonderful statement from the Iroquois Confederacy about, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. And then a final principle of ecology that we can bring in to think about how it applies to our human society is this notion of humility. It's recognizing the unpredictability of complex systems. And so rather than come up with some technological solution to something and assume it'll work, we need to recognize that human activity affects the entire system in nonlinear and unexpected ways. And so every time we approach things, we can take inspiration from this great line from the Tao Te Ching, which says for humans to be reverent guests of nature. Mm-hmm. So with these principles, the next thing we can ask is, well, what would that actually look like in practice? What would that actually mean in terms of shifts from the civilization that we're living in right now? So I'm just going to take you through just touching on some of those shifts that we'd be looking at if we were to move in this direction. Well, one, would clearly be a reduction in global income inequality with a just transition from fossil fuel economy, the imposition of a global wealth tax, the establishment of universal basic income, and returning significant amount of what's currently privately owned property back to the commons for all humans to share. And with corporations, we would transform the structure of these big transnational corporations so they existed for humanity rather than shareholder returns. And that would mean key thing that some of you might be familiar with this notion of the B Corporation and the idea of the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet. And right now, the great consortiums and some corporations choose to become B Corps and actually establish in their charter this triple bottom line, but they're very few. And as soon as they do that, they're under massive pressure from the system because the system itself is rewarding only one bottom line of profit. So under this scenario, there would be a requirement for corporations, if they wanted to maintain their charter, to actually have to change their structure to have a triple bottom line and to be tested on that in order to maintain the charter. That one change would shift things so powerfully. Another change similarly would be strict limits on advertising, which right now is used to condition people to become these kind of zombie consumers rather than think for themselves. We'd be looking at worker-owned co-ops becoming a major force in global commerce. Companies like Mondragon in Spain have tens of thousands of employees, are super successful, and are examples of what can be done in a cooperative structure. And co-ops naturally live according to more ecological values like equity, fairness, solidarity, democracy, transparency. We'd be looking at a circular economy rather than this throwaway linear economy, which would both increase employment and massively reduce waste with products designed for repair and recycling, sourcing from recycled materials, virtually eliminating waste. Cities would be designed on ecological principles, like with community gardens on every block, extensive use of energy efficient designs, rooftops, aquaponics, and of course cars banned from city centers. We'd be looking at transformation of agriculture, where instead of this monocrops that are destroying the world right now, agroecology would be instituted based on permaculture principles, and they've been shown to be more efficient in crop production than these monocrops, and of course far better impact on the health of the overall ecology, with greater crop biodiversity, water and carbon efficiency, and can be done with a virtual elimination of synthetic fertilizer. As societies, we'd be measuring what we did by measures other than the GDP, which simply measures how efficiently we're turning the natural world into part of the monetized economy. That's all that GDP measures. And instead, it could factor in what things like negatives such as income inequality, environmental pollution, and crime, which would bring down that measurement if societies are doing those things, and factor in positives that are right now not even seen in GDP, like volunteer work, household work, education. And crucially, it would transform the rights of nature. So we can imagine the UN rights of nature, just like we have the rights of human beings that have been, human rights have been such an important part of global discourse since the Second World War. You imagine a UN rights of nature that puts the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity, with personhood given to ecosystems and rivers, which is being done now in a few places, and to high-functioning mammals, and defining ecocide as a crime. And that's something that there's a movement that's started in England that's already having some effect in trying to get that to be accepted at the International Criminal Court. So these are some of the ideas of what we're actually talking about when we're talking about a transformation to an ecological society. But I imagine some of you right now might be looking at these things and going like, this is great, yeah, but thinking about what's going on when I read the newspapers every morning and what Jeremy's talking about come on, like, let's get real here, right? So I want to spend now a few minutes just talking with you a little bit about how culture actually transforms, because it's really surprising when we look back in history to see the kinds of transformations that actually can take place. So I'm going to take you through a few examples first, and we'll look at a little bit of theory. But first, let's look back, for example, at women's suffrage, which never happened until the 20th century, anywhere in the world. In 1897, Emmeline Pankhurst started the National Union for Women's Suffrage. And even then, after 10 years, she managed to get 3,000 people to march for the vote in 1907 in London. Didn't look like she was heading anywhere. And people were telling her to just like that Mary Beard was saying, shut up, women don't have a voice in public sphere. Just 20 or so years later, in UK and followed by the rest of the world, women gained the right to vote. And that was totally unexpected. Again, we see the same thing with civil rights in the United States. When Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, that Montgomery bus boycott lasted for a year. Seemed like maybe almost a hopeless cause, as the black churches were burned, black citizens arrested. Within a decade, there was the March on Washington with over 200,000 people and Martin Luther King's great speech. And then, as we know, very shortly afterwards, the Civil Rights Act was passed into law. And we all know that that was only a partial shift. Massive changes still need to be done to get even close to the dignity that we need in our society. But that was the transformational change. Same thing with same-sex marriage. In 1996, Bill Clinton passed a law, DOMA, that made it look like same-sex marriage was something that was never going to happen in anyone's lifetime. I have some friends who are now married who thought that was it, that's never going to happen. Within 20 years, it's totally overturned. And not only is it overturned, but the majority of Americans now approve of same-sex marriage, even in this more conservative climate that we find ourselves in. We see things like the Me Too movement. Just in 2006, Tarana Burke uses the phrase Me Too for the first time. Never occurred to her, probably, that within 10 years, that hashtag would go viral. Harvey Weinstein would be arrested for sexual assault. And the movement is potentiated to transform these abusive cultural norms. Still has massive places to go, but something massive has already been happening in society. And now we're beginning to see the same kind of thing with climate. And there was Greta Thunberg, just a year ago, sitting there alone in front of the parliament in Sweden. And within a year, 4+ million people on the streets protesting, and a climate emergency, even though it's right now, it's just in name, but it's been declared by the UK, France, Canada, Ireland, and over 1,000 jurisdictions around the world. Now, they've got a long way to go, but when you start to change those headlines, it's amazing how things change from there. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more on in terms of this kind of theory of change. Because what we see is that public support tends to follow a non-linear path of change. And there's kind of 3 phases to it. You have this first early adoption phase, when what you see is people stick with received ideas and opinions even when they become out of date. So a few people are talking about these new ideas, but there's rigidity, inertia. People look around saying, it'll never happen. And then there's a tipping point that begins to happen for one reason or another. And then there's this kind of crescendo of change that takes place, where a key thing is influential thought leaders start to attract increasing numbers of people. And there's this kind of stickiness where the old thinking gets superseded by the pull of new thinking. And you know, the so-called herd instinct sounds pejorative. It's actually just part of what we are as humans. It's a very positive part of wanting to be part of our community and looking about how other people think about us and wanting to be part of the bigger group. But when that begins to shift, it's incredible how quickly that moves towards that new way of thinking. So then you get to this place of widespread adoption and the new stable states, where those new ways of thinking institutionalized. And people look around saying, oh yeah, It was inevitable. It was just a matter of time. So what's the potential for this transition to an ecological civilization? Well, we've got this incredible crisis, right? So we have this huge magnitude of a crisis with the inequality collapse and the breakdown of political norms. And we also have this situation where, with the rise of the internet, we have a far faster transmittal of new ideas around the world, plus an emergent global sense, in spite of all the horrible stuff that we read about every day about the silos on Facebook and everything else. There is an emergent sense of a global shared humanity that is taking place around the world through the rise of internet communication. And if we did do this, it would be really a unique achievement in human history. And these are the things that make it so difficult, though. It's not those other transitions we looked at took place over hundreds or even thousands of years. This one, we only have a few decades at most to make this transition happen. And for this transition, those other ones tended to happen with people not really consciously knowing they were living into this new world, but it just naturally self-organized. This one has to happen through our own conscious change in our values and behavior. But there's one thing that kind of helps us even more along this kind of nonlinear path of change to understand what is the possibility for transformative change. And it's a model of change called the adaptive cycle model, which basically tells us that when society unravels, as is happening now, the future is really up for grabs. And it's a complex model of which I won't go into in too much detail here, but it's a model that's been developed by ecological scientists over some decades. And it looks at all essentially complex self-organized entities, from cells, evolution on Earth, ecosystems. It also applies to human-based complex systems like industries, markets, cultures, and civilizations. And in essence, what this model really shows us is that there's 4 stages to the life cycle of any complex system. And in simple terms, it's like there's a cycle of growth when new ideas are taking root, and it's a sense of exciting ideas. Imagine like a growing industry or a growing market, and there's a sense of like, well, everything's possible, and you're kind of working hard to make it happen. And then you move to a stage of conservation. That growth begins to like sort of calm down, and the conservation can last for a very long time. And in the conservation phase, the interconnections between things get stronger and tighter, and change gets to be much, much harder to take place. Things get to be stable, and the relationships make sense, and that's how things go. But as time moves on, that system becomes less and less adaptable to change from outside, gets more and more brittle. And as it gets more and more brittle, at some point, something happens to cause it to unravel, to lead to a release phase, which in a forest might be a forest fire, or for a stock cycle, it might be a stock market collapse or something like that. But this kind of release phase is what we are beginning to experience now in the world around us. And this is why this is so key, because that release phase, once it's taken place, a new system takes place from that old system that could never have happened during the conservation phase. And the ideas that are prevalent, the ideas that are strongest during that release phase, are the ones that then take root as the system moves through that new spiral, which is why this is so true that when society starts unraveling, that's when the future really is up for grabs. And so just a few slides to finish with here. One thing that we can feel about this transformation to the new society, the ideas are already there. Frameworks exist, like this is one from Movement Generation here in the Bay Area. Like people have thought through what it is, how we can shift through a just transition from where we're at right now to this kind of new future we're looking at. And the grassroots organizations are taking place, they're arising all around the world. People are getting this sense of what we need. It's still just a small number of people who are calling it an ecological civilization, but there are hundreds of millions of people who know in their gut what is wrong with what's going on and what we're moving to. So that's what we're talking about. Not trying to straitjacket things into some concept, but offering this umbrella, this big tent for all the different areas, all the different visionaries, all the different work that people are working on towards what this new civilization can be. And I'll just leave you with this quote that I'm sure many of you know well, which I really love, because it's so true, by Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And here we are, a small group of citizens right here. And so at this point, what I want to do is just pause for a few moments, and let's just open it up for some Q&A right now. So thank you for that.